Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. My name's Alex Mercer. I'm 39 years old and have been a licensed crane operator for over a decade. I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where the skyline is littered with ongoing construction and steel skeletons clawing their way into the clouds. I've spent most of my adult life sitting inside a cab 40 stories above the city, maneuvering steel beams, concrete panels, and rebar cages with millimeter precision. It's a job of patience, focus, and trust. One slip of the lever, and you could end up killing someone on the ground. I never imagined that precision would be the only thing keeping me alive. The outbreak didn't start like the movies. There was no sudden citywide panic, no sirens blaring or media blackout. It started like a whisper, quiet and strange. On the morning of September 14th, I arrived at the job site near the Strip District at 5:30 a.m. as usual. The sun hadn't come up yet, and the city was cloaked in a damp mist rolling off the Allegheny. I parked my truck 2 blocks from the site, parking's always a nightmare, and walked past the dim outline of produce vendors setting up their stalls for the day. It all felt normal, even dull, but by the end of that day, normal would be nothing more than a memory. Our project was a 35-story mixed-use tower going up beside an old brick warehouse they were converting into retail space. My crane, a red Liebherr 550 ECH, was parked dead center of the site. I liked working that tower. It gave me a good view of the river and the bridges crossing into downtown. The elevator took me to the 12th floor. Then it was stairs up to the operator's cab, about 300 feet above the ground. Most people would hate the climb. I liked the solitude. That morning, the only oddity was our rigger, Bobby Tran, showing up late. Bobby was never late. He was a wiry guy from Homestead, former Marine turned iron worker, always chewing gum and humming classic rock under his breath. When he finally arrived around 6:45, he looked pale and sweaty, eyes bloodshot like he'd been on a bender. When I asked if he was all right, he just mumbled something about a rough night and waved me off. By 7:30, we were swinging loads into place like always. I was moving a rebar cage into the southeast corner when I noticed Bobby, down on the slab, stumble and vomit. I radioed in, asking if he needed relief. No answer. Then suddenly, he was back on his feet, unsteady but upright. The rest of the crew didn't seem too concerned. Construction workers are used to pushing through colds, hangovers, whatever. But something about the way he moved, it stuck with me. It wasn't until the lunch whistle that the first real sign of danger appeared. Our site foreman, Miguel Ortega, a big guy with a booming voice and a reputation for being a safety fanatic, came running down the rebar scaffold yelling for everyone to get back now. He was pointing toward the northeast gate where a woman was staggering toward the job site. She wasn't dressed for construction. Gray hoodie, blood-stained jeans, and barefoot. Her face was twisted, almost grimacing, and her movements were jerky and sudden, like she was half seizing. At first, we thought she was high or hurt. Then she lunged at one of the laborers, grabbed his forearm, and sank her teeth in. Screams followed. Real, primal screams. The guy, his name was Kevin, a temp hired just the day before, fell back bleeding as the woman kept clawing at him. Miguel and 2 others pulled her off and shoved her down with a folding barricade. She didn't react like a person. She kept snarling, biting, even as her nose smashed against the pavement. Her jaw didn't stop moving. It was surreal. Someone called 911, and the dispatcher said EMS would be delayed due to unusual citywide emergencies. That was the first real warning. The crew was told to clear out, but I stayed in the cab. I had binoculars and a better view up high. Downtown wasn't right. I could see little pockets of chaos near Market Square. People running and cars blocking intersections. Smoke rising from somewhere near Station Square. My radio was blowing up with chatter from site managers trying to reach crews who weren't responding. Something was happening. Something big. Around 2 p.m., the site went into lockdown. That's not a real thing for a construction site, but Miguel made the call. He had 2 guys weld the gates shut with portable torches, block the pedestrian entrance with rebar cages, and moved everyone inside the skeleton of the lower floors. We had a shipping container that doubled as a break room, and they moved Kevin there. He was pale and moaning, barely conscious. Bobby was gone. No one saw him leave, but when we checked his tool chest, it was untouched. His harness still hung on the hook. By 4 p.m., phones stopped working. At least cell service did. Some guys had walkie-talkies, but no one outside the site was responding. Pittsburgh's skyline looked off. Fires in several buildings. A plume of smoke rose from across the river, looked like the North Shore. Sirens were everywhere then. Silence. And then Kevin died. Only he didn't stay dead. We had 6 guys in the container with him. Miguel, 2 electricians, the site medic, and 2 laborers. I watched from the crane as they suddenly burst out of the container. One guy screaming, arm torn open. Kevin had gotten up. His body, mangled and drained, lurched out of the door like some twitching, rabid animal. Miguel was the one who pinned him with the steel pipe. He didn't stop swinging until there was no more movement. The thing that was Kevin was gone. There was no way to deny it now. Something had gone wrong on a massive scale. Miguel climbed up to my cab that evening, breath heaving, arms shaking. He told me point blank what I'd suspected. "Alex, the city's gone. They're calling it a viral thing on the emergency channels. People are attacking each other. Dying, then getting back up. No cure, no help." We took stock. There were 14 of us left on site. The gates were locked. The site had food for a day or 2, mostly vending machine snacks and coffee packs. Water came from a hose hooked to a temporary city main. No weapons besides tools. Night fell like a black curtain. The Strip district was deathly quiet. No horns, no nightlife, no lights. Just firelight and distant screams. I slept in the cab, high ground. Miguel and the others barricaded themselves in the concrete stairwell of the 2nd floor. We agreed. Stay quiet, stay put, and wait it out. That was only day 1. Day 2. I woke at dawn to the low, eerie sound of something dragging against metal. I looked down from the cab and saw a man clawing at the side fence. His hands were bloody, nails gone, face half torn. He was wearing a police vest, but it was shredded and coated in gore. He wasn't moaning like a person. He was snarling like a cornered animal. And he wasn't alone. There were now at least 20 of them outside the site, moving in that awful jerky way, bumping into rebar and fencing. Some were fresh, still looking like people. Others weren't. One was missing its lower jaw entirely, tongue flapping as it bumped along the mesh fencing. That morning, I climbed down to help Miguel and the others regroup. They had built a makeshift barricade inside the slab levels using cement bags, buckets, and steel bars. Smart thinking, but unsustainable. Miguel laid out the options. We stay here, we die slow, or we get supplies. Fuel, food, something. A guy named Darren, an old steel worker with a busted knee, pointed out that the warehouse next door, an old Granger supply depot, might have tools, radios, maybe even safety gear. It was just past the north fence. We agreed to send a small group, Miguel, myself, and Leah, a concrete tech from Sharpsburg. She was quiet but sharp, knew her way around tools, and had been in the Army Reserves before switching careers. We made a plan: cut the back fence, cross the alley, and be back in 20 minutes. But nothing goes to plan in a situation like that. We left around 10 a.m. Leah carried a crowbar. Miguel had a hammer from the tool shed. I brought a bolt cutter and my heavy steel wrench. We slipped through the fence and into the alley. It smelled like smoke and rot. The warehouse door was locked, but Miguel managed to wedge it open using a pry bar. Inside was chaos. Supplies scattered, paper everywhere, and blood smears across the floor. We moved cautiously, gathering what we could: gas cans, flashlights, gloves, a few high-powered batteries, and a boxed emergency radio still sealed in plastic. And that's when we heard the scream. It came from upstairs, a voice, female, desperate. We should have left. Every instinct said leave, but we didn't. We found her in the office loft, a young woman, maybe in her 20s, trapped under a collapsed ceiling panel. Her name was Riley, an intern who'd been working late when the outbreak started. She'd survived by hiding under a desk, using a fire extinguisher to fend off one of the infected. Her leg was broken, but she was alive. It took all three of us to lift the debris off her. Leah checked her for bleeding. Clean break, no bites. We carried her back, using a wheeled dolly we found in the back hall. And that's when the infected found us. A group of 5 came shambling around the back alley. Too fast, too many. We ran. Miguel swung the hammer like a madman, clearing the way. I remember hitting one in the head with my wrench and feeling the skull give in with a sickening crack. Leah pulled Riley while I covered her flank. One of the infected lunged from behind a collapsed trash bin, and I twisted, barely in time, bringing the wrench down on its temple. It crumpled to the pavement, but another was already closing in, arms flailing, mouth opening and snapping like it could smell the warmth on us. Leah screamed, not out of fear but frustration, as the dolly got caught in a crack between uneven slabs. She pulled harder. Riley whimpered and started slipping off the edge. I reached out with one hand, steadying her while pivoting on my foot to drive my wrench into the side of another approaching figure's neck. It didn't stop right away. It just gurgled and grabbed at my vest until I gave it another blow to the skull. The resistance I felt then, the wet crunch of breaking through bone, was something I'd never forget. We were running on instinct, adrenaline, muscle memory, from 100 near misses on job sites that had nothing to do with death until now. Miguel was behind us, breathing hard, his hammer glistening. He turned, struck another in the jaw so hard its head twisted completely backward, and then kicked it into the wall. But there were too many. He looked at me once, just once. No fear, just grim acceptance. He said something I didn't hear. Then he turned back toward the alley entrance and charged 2 more figures coming from the shadows, dragging them into a stack of rebar and half-buried pallets. It collapsed on them all with a terrible clang of metal. The screaming stopped. The alley was full of echoes and blood. I don't know how we made it back. The next few minutes were a blur of running, dragging, and slamming through that broken section of fence. I remember my arms were burning from hauling Riley's weight, and Leah's hands were blistered and red from gripping the dolly handle. We collapsed on the slab just inside the perimeter. My chest heaved, but I kept my eyes on the gate. I waited for Miguel to come crawling through. He never did. The other survivors helped us pull Riley inside. Darren, grim-faced and silent, sealed the breach behind us with tack welds and a welded steel plate from the elevator maintenance rig. The torch hissed in the silence like it was scolding us for trying to live. I stood there for several minutes after, staring at the scorch marks on the metal, wishing they were enough to keep the world out. Riley had a clean tib-fib fracture. Leah splinted it using scrap wood and duct tape. We had no morphine, no antibiotics, just a construction site first aid kit and a few over-the-counter painkillers someone had found in a foreman's truck. Riley was conscious but barely lucid. She kept mumbling names, maybe her co-workers, maybe family. She said one word over and over, Monroeville. That was across the city, east of us, maybe where she lived. We told her we'd try to help. None of us believed it yet. We were down to 12 people now, and the atmosphere had changed. Fear was in every breath. It wasn't the sharp panic from day one anymore. This was a slow, creeping dread. The kind that wraps around your lungs and makes you question every decision. Darren gathered us by the shipping container that night. He'd found a working emergency radio in the Granger's stash, and it ran on D batteries. He turned it on and dialed through static until finally we caught fragments of a transmission. Repeat, do not attempt to reach downtown areas. Military withdrawal in progress. Designated shelters in Morgantown, Harrisburg, and Fort Indiantown Gap are at capacity. Use extreme caution. Infected are drawn to light and sound. Repeat. Then it cut off. Fort Indiantown Gap was a National Guard training facility near Lebanon County. That was over 150 miles away. Useless. The shelters were full, the city was abandoned, and even the soldiers were pulling out. We were on our own. We spent the night barricading every opening on the lower level of the building under construction. Cinder blocks, I-beams, rolls of insulation, anything heavy or hard to climb. We used every spool of tie wire we had to secure rebar panels like a medieval palisade. I returned to my crane that night. High ground again. I slept, curled up in the cab with a framing nailer under my arm and a wrench by my leg. Sometime after midnight, I woke to something tapping the steel beneath me. It wasn't the wind or settling metal. It was rhythmic, measured. I leaned over the edge and saw one of them below, slapping a length of rebar against the support beam. Over and over, no expression. Just a twisted grin and hollow eyes. Like it remembered. Like it hated. I didn't sleep after that. Day 3. The sky was gray when morning came. No sun, just clouds tinged yellow with smoke. The wind carried the scent of burnt rubber, decaying meat, and something chemical. The infected were thicker around the perimeter now. At least 40 by our count, maybe more. Most wandered aimlessly, bumping into fence posts and crane counterweights. But some stood still for hours, just staring through the mesh like they were waiting for something to open. Inside the site, morale was cracking. Riley was stable, but her fever worried Leah. We had almost no clean water left, and the portable tanks we'd filled were running low. Food was even worse. Breakfast was a single granola bar split among 3. I gave mine to Riley. I wasn't hungry anymore, not in the normal sense. Hunger had been replaced by a cold ache in my stomach that no food could fix. Darren pulled me aside around mid-morning. He'd found blueprints for the underground garage levels in the site office. 2 subfloors meant to connect to an old service tunnel running under the Strip District, once part of the city's coal delivery network in the 1930s. Most were sealed, forgotten by time and development. But the door was there, marked on the plan like a promise. If it wasn't collapsed, it could lead us out. There was one problem. The entry hatch was at the very bottom of the elevator shaft, which hadn't been cleared or secured since the project halted. No power meant no elevators, and the shaft was full of loose cable, debris, and a floor of stagnant water. Still, it was a shot. We spent the afternoon rigging ropes and pulleys to lower a small team down. I volunteered, of course. Darren insisted on going too, and we took a third, Geo, a quiet, no-nonsense carpenter from Greenfield who was good under pressure and didn't talk unless he had something worth saying. We took headlamps, harnesses, 2 claw hammers, a crowbar, and the emergency radio. We didn't know what we'd find down there. The descent was slow. The elevator shaft was pitch black, the kind of dark that eats light. Our headlamps barely cut through the air, thick with dust and rust particles. At the base, water pooled to our knees, cold, foul-smelling, with floating insulation scraps and metal shards. The hatch was there, just as the blueprint had shown. We cleared debris from the rusted hinges and pried it open. A wave of stale, ancient air rolled out, dry and metallic. The tunnel was real. We crawled in. It sloped gently downward, carved from stone and reinforced with arched steel beams. It was narrow, just wide enough for 2 people shoulder to shoulder. Every step echoed, but it was clear, bone dry, untouched. We walked for almost 20 minutes in silence, stopping only when the radio crackled. Static, then Leah's voice. She was panicked. "They're breaching. North Gate. Rebar panels failing. You need to get back, now." We turned and ran. The next 15 minutes were a blur, scrambling up the ladder, shouting orders, trying to reach the surface. By the time we emerged into the lower floors, the site was chaos. Infected had torn through the north gate, shoving the makeshift barricade until the welds popped. They were inside. Construction tools are not weapons, but we use them as such. Sledgehammers, framing nailers, rebar rods. I saw Geo knock one down with a spade shovel and then stomp its chest until the ribs cracked. Darren was bleeding from a shoulder wound but still swinging. Leah had pulled Riley into the cab of a telehandler, barricading the door. 2 others were hiding inside the concrete formwork on the south side. We pulled them free and drove the machine across site, clearing a path to the freight elevator shaft. It was the only place left to run. We regrouped at the shaft, 8 of us. That was all that remained. Leah helped Riley into a harness. We lowered her down first. One by one, we followed. The last one down was me. As I descended, I watched the infected flood the upper slab like ants. They knew. They followed noise, warmth, maybe even scent. But they didn't think, not the way we did. They didn't scan the rebar lattice work for structural weaknesses or check the ground for tripping hazards. They didn't plan. They just moved, relentless and inhuman. That gave us the only edge we had left. While they were still trying to pull down the rebar panels and wedge their limbs through cracks in the barricades, I vanished into the shaft below, swallowed by steel and concrete. At the bottom, the tunnel was damp with condensation and the smell of iron. I sealed the hatch behind me with bolts through the rusted guide rings. It wouldn't hold forever, but it would give us time, maybe hours. Enough, I hoped, to figure out our next step. 8 of us were left. Leah, Darren, Geo, Riley, and 4 others. Michelle, an apprentice electrician with burns on both arms from a failed generator hookup 2 days ago. Walt, an HVAC tech who rarely spoke and carried his father's dog tags like a rosary. Amir, a Pakistani engineer who'd only arrived on site the week before, quietly brilliant and clearly in shock. And Jenna, a civil intern from CMU who had somehow held it together better than most of us. We sat in the dark for nearly 10 minutes before speaking. The shock of the escape, the reality of Miguel's sacrifice, the proximity of death, everything pressed in on us. I finally broke the silence with a status check. We accounted for injuries. Darren's shoulder had been torn by one of the infected during the fight. Riley's leg remained splinted, but her fever was worsening. She murmured names in her sleep now, possibly family, possibly dreams. No one had eaten since the previous morning. We had 2 bottles of water, a half-full thermos of instant coffee, and 2 protein bars among us. We were alive, but just barely. The tunnel extended in both directions. One end curved back toward the Allegheny River. The other sloped east, possibly toward the old freight rail corridors near Penn Avenue. We had no reliable maps, only blueprints of the garage levels and faint recollections of the old utility routes. Amir suggested the eastern path might intersect with maintenance access points, storm drains or substation crawlspaces. It was our best shot. So we moved. Single file, flashlights flickering on damp walls, steel columns groaning above us. The deeper we went, the colder it got. It was the kind of penetrating chill that had nothing to do with air temperature and everything to do with being forgotten. These tunnels hadn't seen a crew in decades. Old graffiti, some dated as far back as 1981, lined the curved walls. There were rusted steel lockers, broken pallets, and the remains of rodent nests, all buried under years of dust. After an hour, we found our first junction chamber, an open space with 3 branching tunnels and an old workbench bolted to the wall. A cracked emergency light above us flickered once, then died. Geo checked the side passages while I laid Riley down beside a stack of old maintenance crates. Her forehead burned beneath my fingers, and her breathing had taken on a shallow, wheezing rasp. We couldn't go much farther without risking her life, but stopping for too long was also a death sentence. Jenna and Michelle scavenged through the old storage bins and found an ancient first aid kit, sealed in plastic and wrapped in what used to be duct tape. Inside were some gauze pads, iodine swabs, a rusted pair of scissors, and a few packets of rehydration salts. No painkillers, no antibiotics. Still, the iodine helped. Leah used it to clean Riley's leg again, and we poured the rehydration salts into one of the remaining bottles. Riley sipped, barely conscious. We made camp there for the night. I took the first watch. In the quiet, I heard things. Not voices, not footsteps, just the hum of the earth above us, the city groaning under its own weight. Distant creaks, muffled thuds. Maybe something collapsed, maybe not. I stared down one of the unlit side tunnels for what felt like hours, half expecting one of those hollow-eyed things to come crawling out, but nothing did. Around 3 a.m., Darren tapped me out. His shoulder had stiffened, and I could tell the wound hurt more than he let on, but he insisted. "Let me earn the air I'm breathing," he muttered, half grimacing, and took up a guard position near the side tunnel. I closed my eyes for the first time in 2 days. When I woke, daylight was breaking, not from above, but through a square shaft in the tunnel ceiling, covered by a rusted hatch. Amir had found it during the night and managed to climb partway up using a service ladder still bolted to the wall. He said it opened near an alley behind a fire-damaged parking structure. We took a vote: leave Riley and 2 others behind in the chamber with the walkie, or move together. No one wanted to split. So we rigged a sling from cargo straps, and Darren and I carried Riley on our shoulders while the others covered us. The climb was brutal, 20 feet of tight clearance and rust flakes cutting into our palms. When Amir popped the hatch, we were greeted by sunlight, muted by soot and smoke, but real, and the broken skyline of Pittsburgh's Lower East End. From our vantage, we could see everything. The Strip District swarming with movement, pillars of smoke rising from collapsed structures, and streets filled with abandoned vehicles and toppled traffic lights. But no people. No living ones anyway. We climbed out into the alley just past noon. It was strangely quiet. Birds were gone. Dogs, too. The only sound was the wind rattling a bent street sign and the distant crackle of something burning. We moved fast, ducking beneath windows and avoiding main streets. Leah had spotted a church 2 blocks east, a place she remembered from childhood. St. Mark's Lutheran, near the edge of Lawrenceville. Churches were built strong. With luck, it might still be standing. It was. The front doors were chained, but the rear entrance, leading to a side chapel, had been forced open. We stepped inside to find the place had been used as a refuge. Cots, empty cans, battery lanterns. Notes scrawled on the walls. Went south, Harrisburg full. Stay away from downtown, it's in the air. Don't trust the radio, static is safer. And most chilling of all, near the back wall, painted in bold black strokes, they learn, they follow, they wait. We locked every door and barricaded every window. There were no infected inside, no bodies. Just echoes and dust and fear baked into every surface. We brought Riley to the sacristy and gave her the last of the water. Her fever had dropped slightly, but she was still weak. Leah kept her hand on Riley's forehead like a mother, her expression distant. I spent the afternoon checking the perimeter. We weren't the first people to hole up there, but we might be the last. The storm cellar beneath the church held canned goods, some expired, some still edible, and 2 crates of bottled water. Enough to last us maybe 3 more days if rationed. The power was dead. Cell service was gone. But the structure held, and for a brief moment, we felt like we could breathe. That night, I climbed the bell tower. It gave me a view north toward the river and east toward the railroad tracks. In the fading light, I saw movement in both directions. Figures staggering through the street in slow, predictable paths. Some paused, listening. Others circled intersections as if waiting for a signal. None of them moved like they used to, and that was the worst part. They weren't just wandering anymore. They were searching. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in an amber haze, I realized something. This wasn't an outbreak anymore. It was an evolution. The infected were changing, not just in body, but in behavior. Slower, yes, but more focused, more coordinated. They didn't think like us, but they didn't need to. That thought kept circling my mind as I crouched in the bell tower, watching them drift below like ash in the wind. They weren't aimless anymore. At intersections, they paused, some tilting their heads like they were listening for something the rest of us couldn't hear. Occasionally, one would turn back, nudge another with its shoulder, and change direction entirely. It was subtle, but it wasn't random. These things weren't the feral, mindless creatures we had believed them to be. They were mapping us. I climbed back down, careful not to disturb the warped brass of the disused bell, and met Leah at the stairwell. Her face was drawn with fatigue, but her eyes remained sharp, locked in that zone between exhaustion and instinct. Riley was stable, barely. Her fever had plateaued, and she'd eaten a few spoonfuls of canned peaches. That alone felt like a small miracle. But we knew it was temporary. Without real medical supplies, time was the one thing we didn't have. Inside the church, the rest of the group had found a rhythm. If not comfort, then at least motion. Gio and Amir were reinforcing the boarded windows with salvaged pewbacks. Darren was asleep in the narthex, a fire axe beside him and his wounded shoulder wrapped in duct tape and gauze. Jenna was cataloging our remaining food. Michelle had taken to writing on the walls. Diagrams, notes, theories. Not out of madness, but survival. She marked which streets we'd seen movement on, which hours had the most activity, what the infected responded to. She was treating it like a project, something to solve. We all coped in different ways. That night, I couldn't sleep. None of us could really, but I wandered through the sanctuary under the faint glow of solar lanterns we'd scavenged. I sat near the altar and looked up at the stained glass windows, cracked but still holding their color. Christ in the garden. The Last Supper. One of a faceless crowd gathered at a river's edge. I'd never been religious, but I found myself whispering things under my breath, half prayers, half promises. I didn't know who I was saying them to. Around 2 a.m., we heard something outside. Not the usual stumbling shuffle of the infected, but sharper. Metal on concrete. A dragging chain. Walt and I moved to the choir loft, peering through the high windows with field binoculars. Below, in the street near the front entrance, 3 infected stood in a triangle. One had a length of rebar dragging behind it, scraping the sidewalk. Another was crouched over something, we couldn't see what, while the third stood still, watching the church, its head tilted slowly, side to side. Walt didn't speak. He didn't need to. We were being watched. The next morning, we gathered around the vestry table. There was no debate anymore. We couldn't stay. The tunnel had bought us time, and the church had given us shelter, but both were temporary. We needed to move, and fast. Amir had spent the night drawing routes based on older city infrastructure. If we could reach the Bloomfield Bridge, we might make it to the old Children's Hospital site, which had reportedly been turned into a forward command post by National Guard units before communications failed. It was a long shot, but it was something. We stripped down our supplies. 1 bag of canned goods, 2 bottles of water, basic medical gear, and the last working radio. Riley was too weak to walk, so we rigged a makeshift stretcher from curtain rods and fire hose. Darren, even with his shoulder, volunteered to help carry her. He didn't trust anyone else to do it right. We left behind everything non-essential. Sentiment had no place here. We waited until dusk. Less visibility, less risk of being seen from a distance. It was a gamble, but everything was now. We exited through the storm cellar beneath the east wing and emerged in a narrow alley behind a derelict pharmacy. The streets were clearer than the day before, but that only made it worse. The silence was unnatural. No wind, no birds, not even the groan of steel or crackle of fire. Just the sound of our boots on broken asphalt and Riley's shallow breathing. At 34th and Penn, we saw the first sign of a kill zone. Burned-out vehicles had been pushed into a barricade, likely by civilians or some remaining city personnel. Black scorch marks painted the pavement, and bone fragments littered the sidewalk. A severed hand, wedding ring still on the finger, rested beneath a payphone shell like someone had tried to make a final call and never finished dialing. Michelle held the radio and scanned frequencies every few minutes. Nothing but static. We reached the Bloomfield Bridge just after 8 p.m. It was intact, but the far end was blocked by a military truck turned sideways, front axle blown. We moved fast, crossing in the shadow of the old iron girders. The city opened up beneath us. Rows of row houses, alleys choked with debris. Cars piled against storefronts like something had swept through them. From up there, Pittsburgh looked like a fossil. As we approached the far end of the bridge, Gio halted and raised a hand. We followed his line of sight. In the shadows just past the wrecked truck, 3 figures crouched, barely visible, but unmistakably human-shaped. One stood and stepped forward. It wasn't infected. It wore a vest, carried an M4 slung low, and had a headlamp clipped to its shoulder. U.S. Army insignia. He waved us forward, but kept one hand near his weapon. Behind him, 2 others emerged, a woman in medic fatigues and a younger soldier with a radio pack. We froze, unsure if this was a trap. The older soldier, tall, mid-40s, dark-skinned, eyes sharp, spoke first. "Name's Master Sergeant Travis Cole. Y'all look half dead. Come on, we've got a mobile field unit down the hill. What's your status?" It didn't feel real, not at first. Actual uniforms, clean weapons, structure, order. we moved toward them, hesitant but hopeful. Their field unit was a converted high school gym about a mile away, surrounded by sandbags and floodlights. The infected didn't come near it, not because they couldn't, but because they hadn't yet figured out how. Cole said they rotated locations every 48 hours to stay ahead of the ones that learned. They had medical supplies, food, clean water, and most importantly, working communication. It turned out there were still safe zones. Fort Indiantown Gap had been overrun, but Wright-Patterson near Dayton was holding. A convoy was preparing to move in 2 days. Space was limited. They were prioritizing skilled personnel and the wounded. We had both. Riley was immediately admitted. Leah, Michelle, Amir, and I were flagged for operational consideration. Darren and Gio declined the convoy offer. They'd seen too much. They said they wanted to find their families, what was left of them in the South Hills, and try to carve something out in the ruins. We hugged, exchanged last words, and I watched them walk into the smoke-hazed dawn with fire axes slung across their backs. 2 days later, the convoy rolled out. 57 survivors, 7 vehicles, 2 Humvees at point and rear. I sat behind the driver of a supply truck, hands gripping my wrench like it was the only thing keeping me from floating off the earth. As we passed the remains of downtown, I turned and looked at the skyline one last time. Cranes frozen mid-motion, towers half-finished, streets tangled with memory and blood. My city. I didn't survive because I was strong or brave. I survived because I stayed calm, because I knew steel and gravity better than most, and because others died buying me time. Miguel, Walt, the nameless ones we passed in alleys and stairwells. I was a crane operator. I lifted things. I measured distance. I knew how to calculate a load and balance against the wind. But no one had trained me for the weight of memory, the pull of loss, the inertia of survival. This wasn't over, not even close, but we were still alive, and for now, that would have to be enough. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.